So hi everybody, and welcome to our webinar tonight on transporting cattle safely. My name is Stacey Domolewski. I am the Science and Research and Innovation Coordinator for the Beef Cattle Research Council, and I'm going to be your moderator for tonight. Tonight's webinar is co-hosted in part with partnership with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Our session tonight should last approximately 1 hour, but it could go a little longer depending on the number of questions you have during tonight's question and answer period. If you're on Twitter, please tweet along with us tonight using #BeefWebinar. And we are recording this session, and I will email you a link to the recording later this week. So if you do have anything you want to watch again or anybody you want to pass it on to, you can do that. Of course, you're going to be able to hear and see tonight's presenter, but we can't hear or see you. So if you do have any questions, you can type into the, there is a little box on the bottom of your screen that will say Q&A. You can type any of your questions there. We'll take them throughout the whole presentation, but we're going to answer them towards the end of the hour tonight. If your internet connection is being a bit slow, it could help to close the webcam videos. That means you're not going to see our presenters, but it will hopefully make the slides come through a little bit better and the audio load a little, and the audio sound a bit better as well. So with that, here's what we're going to be covering tonight. And I'll kick things off by introducing our speaker. So Dr. Schwartzkopf-Genswein is a senior research scientist at Agriculture Agri-Food Canada. Her expertise is in the area, and she was on a farm in southern Alberta, active in the feedlot business, which was instrumental into sparking her interest in cattle, their care and management. Karen works in many different areas in terms of animal welfare and is a past winner of the Canadian Beef Industry Award for Outstanding Research and Innovation. With that, Karen, I will get you. You can turn on your webcam, and I'll get you to share your screen in a second here. Yes, we can. So you're good to go.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to everybody who's on and listening at this time in the evening. I give you credit. You should be out shopping for your wives or husband's Christmas present, but instead you're sitting here listening to me, so kudos to you. I know that I see the title of my slide is a little bit different than Stacey had on the agenda, but ultimately it's really the same thing. Safety and transport safety is really linked to animal welfare and how we do it best and the best management practices. Today I would like to go over with you kind of the culmination of all of the research that we've done in this area over the last 10 years or so, probably more than that now. And again, I want to give credit to the BCRC, the Beef Cattle Research Council, Alberta Beef Producers, and Ag Canada for helping to share these, fund these studies. It's really important, and without their investment in this type of work, it would never be done. It is probably the first work of its kind done in North America, and it was well overdue at the time of funding. So happy to share the results of this with you tonight. So I just want to start by, again, why do we want to do work in this area? Why is transport important to animals and to transport of cattle? Really, it comes down to it's a stressful event, and it's probably one of the most stressful events in an animal's life. The potential stressors of transport are many, and you can see them listed here. It's probably one of the times where you have the greatest number of stressors imposed on an animal in a single point in time. So here we have things like handling, so that includes loading and unloading. The animals are put in a novel environment. Often those animals have never been inside a trailer. They may go through an auction. If that's the case, they are again loaded and unloaded. They may be mixed with unfamiliar cattle. They are subject to restriction of feed and water during transport, of course, because we don't provide that for them within the trailers at least. Rest stops, that's a question now. It's another research question that we're looking at to see how useful rest stop for feed and water is. Environmental conditions on the trailer, of course, that's really going to vary by time of year and season, and that can have huge impact on what happens to those cattle inside the trailer. The effects of loading density, so they can be loaded too loosely or too tightly, and that can impact welfare, has implications for falling and injuries and so on. If you've ever ridden in the back of a trailer, if you've ever been on a trailer, I actually tried to do this once, and I can honestly say it is a feat to maintain balance even for a short period of time. So you can imagine those animals in a trailer over a 10-hour or 30-hour trip, the energy that it takes to maintain balance for that entire time. Of course, the transport duration is a huge factor. Short distances sometimes can be possibly as stressful as long transports. They seem to kind of settle down in the middle of a transport, but the length of time they're off of food and water, and again, that energy expenditure and fatigue come into that transport duration stress. And of course, injury can always be associated with loading and unloading animals, slipping, falling, falling down in the trailer, etc. So I often get asked, how do we assess transport stress? And this is I mean, I've talked about this topic quite a bit. I think people kind of know, but there's still many producers and truck drivers that really don't know how this is done. So really it comes down to two things, or actually one thing. It's change from normal. It's really what we're looking for. So when we go to assess an animal, we look to see if there's been a change in its behavior or has there been a change in its physiology. And so we can measure these, the best ways to measure them non-invasively. That means not causing more stress to the animal at the time you're taking those measurements. The best way to look at either behavior and physiology is to make a comparison of what their behavior and physiology was like before they went on the transport and what it's like when they come off of the transport. So some things that we may have looked at or we might look at, so again, before, during, and after transport, we make the comparisons. Some things like respiration rate and panting, drooling, that might be an indicator of heat stress. Feeding and drinking, again, that's an indicator of hunger and or dehydration. Lying and standing time may give us some indication of fatigue. Similar to walking, again, it's an indication if the less amount, lower the amount of walking, it's an indication of fatigue. Things like slipping and falling as they come off the truck. We may also link to that if we're looking for indications of injury and lameness. We might do a locomotion score, a gait score as they come off the truck. And even once they get into the pens after being transported, we can look at things like rumination automatically. You can see here, this animal has a collar in which we can remotely monitor rumination. And usually when animals are stressed, one of the first things they do is stop ruminating. We have looked at feeding behavior as soon as they get off the truck and trailer. Again, if they're really hungry, they'll go to feed right away. But if fatigue is more the issue, they'll go lie down and they won't go to the feed bunk right away. In terms of physiology, the things that we commonly measure, so cortisol, it's a stress hormone. We can measure it in the blood, saliva, and hair. Substance P is a neuropeptide, a biomarker of pain that we've used in the past, works quite well. Immune function, so we look at things like white blood cell count, the neutrophil lymphocyte ratios that give us an indication of a compromised immune system. Acute phase proteins, again, another indication of inflammation that we can look at in those cattle coming off the truck. And of course, a common one is weight loss or shrink. Some other things that we can look at, infrared thermography. So we can get an overall indication of what's happening in terms of the temperature, the body temperature of that animal. We can do whole body scans. We can look at just certain parts of the body to make sure that, depends on what your question is and what you're looking for. We've monitored heart rate before, so as an indicator of stress. You can see these calves here on the bottom picture. They actually have these heart rate monitors or belts around them, and this was an actual trial that we did. These belts stayed on for the duration of the transport, which was a miracle in itself. And we were able to get some really nice information. It works good in the summer, but in the winter, when these electrodes can freeze, you have to have the gel in contact with the skin, and often we cannot measure it during the winter because of that. I mentioned trailer environment. It's a huge factor in terms of dehydration. What happens in the inside during periods of really high temperature or periods of really low temperature. We're able to monitor that very nicely. We have these data logger monitors called eye buttons. They're about the size of a nickel. Within the trailer, we usually put them on the top of the roof on both sides of the trailer, and in the middle point here too. And we've put about 45 data loggers in per truck, and depending on the size of the compartment, between 5 and 11 per compartment, and they can measure relative humidity and temperature within the trailer at 1-minute intervals throughout the entire trip. Here you can see on the bottom we have a trailer with an eye button on the outside, and we put one on the outside so we compare the ambient temperature or the outside temperature to what's happening on the inside of the trailer. So here is a picture of Earl, and I always like to show this picture, and my slide says, what science tells us that Earl can't. Well, Earl, he was one of the experienced drivers that we had taking part in one of our first large-scale studies that we did on transport. Earl took great pleasure in telling me every time we came out to meet him, telling how useless the study was and how he could tell us everything we needed to know. We didn't have to spend all this money and time. And sometimes I did agree with Earl, but I would like to say that really, I would like to thank Earl for putting us up to the challenge of doing this. And I think we have to realize that although Earl and truck drivers and people in the industry like Earl know a lot and are very skilled in what they do, there are still many things, when we ask some very basic questions, there's still lots of things that Earl couldn't tell us, or the transport industry couldn't tell us about what was happening with those cattle. So I think science has a huge role to play in providing that information. So see, here's some of the overview of what came out of that large-scale study. So relationship between temperature and shrink. This is a no-brainer. It makes sense. We found that for every 1 degree rise in ambient temperature, outside temperature shrink increased by 0.04%. When we looked at the effect of the relationship between shrink, time on truck, and temperature, you can see really nicely. These graphs show it very clearly. So on the left-hand side, you have shrink and body weight along the side, and time on truck in hours across the bottom. You can see the red arrow at about 30 hours, that shrink starts to plateau. And what does that mean? I often ask producers what this means, and everybody has had many people say to me, well, you can keep transporting them after that point because really they've lost all they're going to lose and you can keep transporting. That is not the message we want to send. In fact, really, that's saying that all the fluid has been lost. Now you're getting into tissue loss here, potential tissue loss. So really that 30-hour mark means that the transport should have ended before they're starting to reach that plateau. If you look at shrink and body weight, the next slide here, and in relationship to mean temperature, you can see at about 15 degrees Celsius, that shrink really starts to increase very rapidly. So that's at a fairly low temperature, but you have to remember inside the trailer with respiration and heat from all the animals, that temperature can rise very quickly. Here we put a nice graphic together kind of combining the temperature, time on truck, and shrink, and we thought this could be a really nice metric for truck drivers to use. So again, along the side, ambient temperature in Celsius, and time on the truck in hours at the bottom. And if we had an example, then an animal was on the truck for 30 hours and the temperature was 20 degrees, that's the black line here, the shrink is 7%. We did some calculations to show that with each example here, you would add 1.5% for feeders. So if it's 7%, you would add 1.56% to that to give you 8.56% shrink for feeders. And likewise, you would add 2.6 and 3.5 for calves and cull cows respectively. Here was another really surprising thing that we found in some of our work. I was really quite surprised when the information came back. We wanted to look at the amount or number of delays some of these transport trucks had. And so we broke them down into the following categories. So border, waiting at the border, unloading, driver rest stop, mechanical failure of the truck, traffic, and weather. And what you see here is the mean time, the mean length of the delay. So in this case at the border, it's 1.3 hours, and 77% of the loads, that's the number in brackets, had this kind of delay. What was really surprising to us, if you go to the final, last column here, and you can see the maximum delay that was under each one of these categories, 15 hours, 12 hours, 15 hours. Although they were infrequent, these are values you have that are added onto the entire trip, onto the transport trip. So it's not just the time in transit, it's the time that they're actually on the truck, including this 15 hours. So that's really important and can have a huge impact on the welfare during those transports. Not surprising here, the relationship between the driver experience and shrink, it came out quite clearly. We were quite surprised that we could see it as clearly as we did. And we had categories, years of experience, so drivers with 0 to 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 10, or greater than 10. And you can kind of see, I put the line there. So drivers with less than 6 years of experience had greater shrink than those drivers that had more than 6 years of experience. And although we didn't do a study to look at exactly why that was, you know, it's easy to attribute some of those things to just skill in driving, knowing how to manage the animals during a crisis, etc. So, and drivers that know how to transport cattle instead of new drivers that might have been transporting other things besides livestock before they started driving livestock truck. We looked at welfare outcomes, and this is, it was a bit more difficult to obtain this information, but we put it down into kind of 3 or 4 main categories. Were the animals lame when they came off the truck? Were they non-ambulatory on the truck? Did they die on the truck? And then we made a category here at the bottom that we called totally compromised, which was the combination of all those factors that I've listed above. So here we see, again, it follows kind of through with what we saw in the shrink. The effective driver experience also, again, important on the welfare of the animals. We have it grouped by category here, so drivers with 0 to 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 10, and greater than 10 years of experience. You can see the totally compromised category, so that's the combination of all these factors, is highest in the 0 to 2 and 3 to 5 years. That's higher, much higher than drivers that had more than 6 years of experience. Type of cattle can also affect welfare outcomes. This is not surprising. We've broken it down by fat, feeder, calves, and culls. And again, the totally compromised cattle, you can see the culls had the greatest number of totally compromised cattle, followed by the calves, and then very few in the fats and feeders. And this is just, again, attributed to the condition of those animals going onto the truck and those animals being very vulnerable. Their lower body condition score, and maybe have lower immunity at that point. Effective time of the truck and temperature on welfare outcomes. These are also very nice and telling graphs. Again, the probability of becoming totally compromised, along the side. And then you can look at the time on truck, and at about that 28 hours, you can see how those welfare outcomes start to skyrocket. So if I had to make a recommendation on kind of the point beyond which we probably should make a cutoff, it's at about that 24 to 28 hours on the truck, and after that they should have a rest. Again, this looking at the probability of totally compromised and the mean temperature, ambient temperature. You can see it's a U-shaped graph here, meaning here it's showing that temperatures below -15 or plus 15 degrees Celsius. You can see that both of those can result in greater or poorer welfare outcomes. Effective shrink and space allowance on welfare outcomes. Here we've got the probability along the side and body weight loss in percent along the bottom. You can see here this dotted line shows that about 10% body weight loss or shrink. Again, these welfare outcomes really start to increase. So the ability of the animal to maintain homeostasis under those conditions, it's much more difficult, and we have a greater number of animals succumbing to being non-ambulatory and dying on the trailer. And probability of becoming totally compromised, again, you can see this graph. It's a bit confusing. I'll tell you what the allometric coefficient is. Here it's a fancy word for space allowance, and it really just is a calculation based, it removes the size or the weight of the animal in that calculation. So essentially what it's saying, it's a U-shaped graph, so it's saying animals that are transported at greater at a greater density than 0.15 meters squared per animal or at a density less than 0.05 meters squared per animal have higher risk of poor welfare outcomes. We did another study, nice information here on the transport of cull cows during the winter and the effects of on welfare and carcass quality. We assessed almost 700 cull cows that were transported from between Alberta and Manitoba. Sorry, they came from Manitoba and were slaughtered in Alberta at a plant here in Alberta. Some of the trailers had sideboards or boarding on the sides used at the driver's discretion. We didn't tell the drivers that they could or couldn't use boarding, so we just kind of tracked it. It turned out that we had kind of three main categories of boarding. You can see here the grouped alternating. So again, grouped meaning there's a group of boards and then an open area. Same thing, group of boards and an open. Alternating is just every second perforation holes are blocked and then totally open. So what did we find? Effects of the board on the trailer environment. As I indicated earlier, trailer environment is very important. Temperature and humidity increase in the trailer when it's stationary, and that just makes sense. Again, there's no airflow through the trailer. The temperature and humidity go up, and there's no way for ventilation to remove that humidity and temperature within the trailer. We did find something interesting here. So trucks in transit that use more boarding were less human than outside. So that was different than what we had expected. We concluded that boarding may increase ventilation when trailers are in transit, so it may cause the air to come more quickly into the ventilation holes that are the perforation holes that are there. And of course, decrease ventilation during stationary periods. So again, that makes sense because there is no airflow to remove that heat and moisture from the trailer. We also looked at the effect of vibration or ride quality and what that may have, effect that may have on carcass quality. So here you can see, the trailer broken down into their compartments: nose, deck, belly, doghouse, and back. We found that the vertical motion, so up and down motion of the trailer, was similar in all of the compartments. We found that the lateral motion, so that's backward and forward motion, was greatest in the back and doghouse, and that makes sense because it's the farthest point from the attachment to the trailer. And horizontal motion was greatest horizontal, so side to side motion was greatest in the nose, back, and doghouse compartments. So how did that relate to bruising and carcass bruising? So out of the almost 700 animals, we had 80% of all carcasses were bruised. 18% had severe bruising and 14% had bruising in one or more location. And most severely bruised carcasses occurred on cows transported in the doghouse. So you can see here I've listed that the doghouse had 3 times more animals transported in the doghouse, had 3 more times bruising than the back, 3.7 times more than the belly, 2 times more than on the deck, and almost 4 times more than on the nose. Another interesting finding we had here was that increasing the duration of waiting time to unload to 30 minutes, just 30 minutes, to 1 hour, increased the odds of severe bruising by 1.18 times. So again, the effect of not unloading those animals very soon and not having delays in unloading is a best management practice. So what did we find in terms of compromise? 50% of all the loads had at least one cow compromised at loading. 3 cows in that study, about 0.04% went down and were euthanized on the trailer. And really, a major finding or conclusion that we came with here was that poor cow condition at loading is the biggest risk factor in determining condition at offloading. And that's not a surprise. So overall conclusions, cull cows had the greatest probability of poor welfare outcomes. That's not unexpected. More welfare issues were observed when animals were transported more than 30 hours. Longer journeys at higher temperatures, increased shrink, and poor welfare outcomes. Cattle shipped at loading densities lower than 0.05 meters squared or greater than 1 meters squared per animal were likely to become downers, non-ambulatory, or deaths, non-ambulatory, or lame. So final message, and I think a really important one that we can't stress enough, is even the best transporters and the conditions cannot compensate for poor loading decisions. That's number one, and we always have to have that in our mind when we're transporting cattle. To follow through with that, I'm not sure how I'm doing for time here, Stacy, but I'm going to go through quickly the prevalence. We've just done a study on prevalence and risk factors of compromised and unfit cattle arriving to auction markets and abattoirs, and that kind of follows from these poor loading decisions. And I think, again, this is really important for us to know as an industry where we're at with these things, and when we're asked, we need to be able to indicate what we're finding in the industry and where we're finding issues. Maybe we have no issues, or maybe where they are, this is the areas that we need to work on. So marketing always means that we have to transport cattle. When we market our animals, I know of no other way to market them without transporting. So transport of compromised cattle or unfit cattle is a major welfare concern, and we know that it is the most visible part of our industry, transport is, and we have to be very conscious and careful that at any point in time, somebody with a camera, and everybody has a camera on their phone, these things are very visible, and things that are not good for the public to see, and animals that are not in good condition or not treated well during these transports are very visible. Transport is a key factor in the condition of the animal at the time of unloading, and loading decisions are very critical, as I stated before. You can see that in some of our earlier results. Again, we want to remove any kind of poor negative or negative image of the industry because of these events that may occur. So when I first started this work, I really wasn't sure myself what the difference was between a compromised and unfit animal. So here are some definitions from CFIA, and just to follow what they have under their compromised animal policy. So for compromised, it's the reduced capacity to withstand transport, but with special provisions can be transported without undue suffering. This means that they must not be shipped to an auction market for sale. They can only be shipped for local transport, and this means to receive care, to be euthanized, or to be humanely slaughtered. In terms of unfit, here the definition is reduced capacity to withstand transport with high risk that the transport would lead to undue suffering. And this means that they could only be shipped for local transport and short distances, and only for veterinary treatment and diagnosis. Here are some quick examples. I'm not going to go through all of them, and this is not a complete list from the CFIA, but just to go through a few, what would be considered compromised: penis injury, bloat, blindness, wounds, amputees, healing after not healed after castration or any other surgical procedure, birth impending with 48 hours, lameness, etc. Examples, and that list is on the CFIA website. Examples of unfit: do not transport. What are they? Unable to withstand without assistance or move without being carried, emaciated, dehydrated, exhausted, rupture of the prepubic tendon, broken limbs or pelvis, in shock or dying, lame. I have fever here in red because how it's very difficult to know if an animal has a fever just by visually looking at it sometimes. So some of these things have to be, I think, reconsidered in the definitions that CFIA gives. Likely to give birth, sometimes it's pretty difficult to tell when that would be, under 48 hours of age, and suspected nervous system disorders. So really, when we looked at all of this, and we tried to see in the literature if there was any information regarding, at least in North America, what some of these values were, there really was a lack of science or data on the prevalence of these types of animals and what were the risk factors associated with them. So we decided, we did get a study funded on, we called it the Compromised Cow Benchmark Study. It was a 2-year study. It was funded by Growing Forward, Alberta Farm Animal Care, Alberta Milk, Alberta Cattle Feeders, and Alberta Beef Producers. This was all our research team from AFAC, from U of C and U of S. I had a master's student through the University of Saskatchewan, Courtney Houston, and this is her master's thesis that I'll be showing you today. The objectives of that study were to assess the number of animals arriving at auctions and abattoirs in unfit condition, and to characterize unfit or compromised conditions, and to characterize which conditions were most prevalent, and identify some risk factors and document how the animals were disposed of. We looked, we sampled both auctions and abattoirs. The facilities we looked at or we worked with were selected on the following basis: those that were willing to participate in the study, the sales throughput volume, their geographic location by north-south, and that boundary was at Airdrie, Alberta. Out of the 22 provincial auctions, we selected 8. We had 4 large and 4 small, so the large was over 65,000 head, small was under 65,000 head. Of 43 provincial abattoirs, 11 were selected, and we had those that had low volume, medium volume, and high volume. You can see the numbers there. So high was greater than 543, and low was less than 275. Medium volume was in the middle. We had 1 federal plant that had over 1 million animals per year. So a big part of this type of work is developing an assessment tool. How do you actually go about assessing if the animals are compromised or unfit? So a big key thing in this development is how repeatable is this tool and how reliable is this tool, just based on visual assessment alone. And this is what producers do, truck drivers do, and inspectors at plants do. So it has to be something visual, and it has to be something that can be repeatable. Certain CFIA criteria, when we looked, they required either diagnostic testing or a physical exam, which is not often possible. So we did not use those in our part of our assessment tool. We did come up with a list with the help of a CFIA consultant, as well as producers and truck drivers in the industry. Data that we also collected, we looked at age, sex, body condition score, mobility score, so that's a lameness score, a mud score, and then a thing that we called a compromised cattle score, so an overall score of what we saw the animal's condition as, and we either said it was fit, compromised, or unfit. Disposal, we looked at if it would be returned to the owner, transported with special provisions to the nearest abattoir, euthanized, so either salvage slaughter, that's a shoot and bleed, or no salvage, sent to rendering. Risk factors, so we had weather, temperature, group size, the total number of animals within the vehicle, the type of vehicle that the animals were transported in, either liner or stock trailer, the market price the week prior, and the transport distance that the animals went. What we did see, the overall prevalence of compromised and unfit, you can see here the highest occurred coming into the provincial abattoir. So 25% were compromised and 6% were unfit. So that was the highest among the auction and federal abattoirs. And makes sense that really it's showing that those types of animals should be going to the provincial abattoir. So it means that the producers are following the rules that way, and it's the appropriate place they should be going. Here showing 13% compromise to the auction. That shows that we can have some work in that area. We shouldn't have that high of a number of compromised animals coming into the auction. And as we would expect, the federal abattoir, the compromised and unfit are very low. So what did we see by, I'll go through each type of place. First, the prevalence at each place or location type. Here we have for auctions, the most prevalent conditions were body score less than 2, animals that were in heavy lactation, and animals that showed indications of pain, so teeth grinding, licking, lifting their legs, whatever the condition was, the visual condition was. Some animals were moderately lame. There was a 0.64%. And so these stars are just kind of the top 5 conditions that we saw, the most prevalent conditions we saw at the auction. Here we are at the provincial abattoirs. So we have quite a few more animals, really high percentage of 17% with pain indicators, and almost 15% of animals coming in there were lame. Some 8% had injuries of their neck, limbs, or body, and 0.03% had body condition score less than 2. So here you can see again, it's very evident that animals that should be coming into the provincial abattoir that are a bit more compromised are showing up there rather than at the federal plants or auction markets. Here we are at the federal abattoir. So body condition score, moderately or severely lame were the highest categories, and even those were very low compared to what we saw in the other location types. Single versus multiple conditions, you can see here very clearly those animals at the provincial abattoir, most of them had multiple conditions, whereas in the federal abattoir, usually that was just a single condition that was seen in terms of compromised. What about the risk factors associated with arriving compromised unfit? A lot of these make sense. So the previous week price, so the odds increased by 1 for every increase in dollar. The week prior price was up. That makes sense. Producers want to ship animals at the highest price possible, and I'm wanting probably at that point to get as many unwanted or culled animals sold at that point in time. Temperature, odds of increasing by 1 for each increase in degree Celsius. So again, the effective temperature, and you saw it in some of our earlier work, that this can really increase compromised, most likely happening on the trailer. A group size, so the odds of being compromised or unfit decrease for every 1.1 additional animal on the trailer. And to me, that just says that animals are shipped, usually probably when they're shipped in those conditions, usually to the abattoir or the auction, they're shipped in smaller groups. Distance, so the odds increase by 1 for each additional kilometer transported. Again, fits with the earlier work that we had done. So animals, again, distance and time on truck really can affect welfare outcomes or increase the poor welfare outcomes. Geography, odds increase by 3.4 in the south over the north. So that tells me that I think in the south we just have more abattoirs and auctions that those animals would go to, and we have places that accept shoot and bleed, and so I think that's why we're clearly seeing that geographic difference. In terms of location, the odds increase by almost 6 times in cattle arriving to provincial abattoirs than auctions, and odds of being compromised increased by 1.7 times in cattle arriving to federal abattoirs versus auctions. So again, that makes sense. Most of those animals are going to the provincial abattoirs. Age, this is not a big surprise. The odds of being compromised or unfit increase for every 3.4 by 3.4 times for mature versus feeder animals, and that's reflecting the cull cows that go either to auctions or abattoirs. So finally, here are the last 3 slides, disposal at auction. So what happens to these animals once they get to the auction market? The compromised animals, most of them are sold. Almost 87% of the unfit animals are also sold. And we had some conditions in which unfit animals were refused and returned. And you can see that's the same number, 6.7, saying that group was refused and then they were returned back to the owner. We had 1.7% that were sent to salvage slaughter. For disposal at provincial abattoirs, 100% of the fit and compromised animals went for regular slaughter, and the unfit, about 89% went for regular slaughter, almost 4% were euthanized, and 7.4% were sent for salvage slaughter. Finally, the federal abattoir, interesting here, unfit, 60% of the unfit animals were euthanized and 40% were sent for regular slaughter. So for take home on this part, overall arrival condition of the cattle was good, between 69 and 98% were fit. Areas needing improvement, so animals sent in heavy lactation, emaciation, so body score less than 2 out of 5, lameness, so we had quite a bit of lameness, moderate and severe lameness. There was quite a bit of severe limb injuries and swelling, and then there was some respiratory signs, so we need to work on that. How do we do that? Really continued education on identifying compromised and unfit cattle for all stakeholders. That's important. This is not easy. It's a pretty big blanket statement, and I think this is where we really need to put in some work in terms of developing a tool that's easy for people to use, repeatable, and kind of keeps us away from those gray areas, which tend to be a problem. I've heard that from many inspectors at plants. So finally, I think I said this already, developing repeatable assessment methods and understanding risk factors will be key in reducing arrival of compromised and unfit cattle, something we can surely work on. So with that, I'm way over time, Stacy, and I'm done.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Karen. So what we'll do now is we will open it up to questions. Sorry, I'll get my slide here properly. Yeah, we'll open it up to questions from you in the audience here.
Mm-hmm.
So this is your chance to type in anything you have. If you look at the top of your screen, or it should be on the bottom actually of your screen, there will be a Q&A box. You can click on that and type in any questions you have, and I will read them out to Karen. So we have had a couple come in during the webinar. So the first one here, Karen, is one that was sent in, I'm assuming at the beginning of your presentation when you were talking about different metrics that measure stress and about how do we measure stress in animals effectively when some of these methods are causing stress in the animal as well.
Mm-hmm. So I didn't spend much time on it, but we really try and measure things as non-invasively as possible, right? So that means either sometimes if we're taking blood sample, we catheterize those animals. If we're looking at treatments like transport treatments, they all are being taken, the blood samples being taken from all of them. So they're all kind of equally stressed, and then stress is additive. So if there is a little bit of stress from the handling and sampling that we do, that is added to the stress of the transport or whatever else those animals have been exposed to. So we are still able to see, even though there is kind of a baseline level of stress. That's also why we have controls in our research studies. And it's all often why we take measurements from the same animals before they're transported and after they're transported, so we can see the differences in those animals. And again, the control groups really help us to sort those out. So they're typically handled and sampled, but they're not exposed to kind of the treatments that we want to see if they're stressing the cattle. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah. So another question here about, besides cull cows, have you done any other work in other types of cattle, and if so, were results similar?
So yeah, we did look at feeders and calves, and so actually we were quite surprised. I mean, some of it you can see on some of the slides I showed you. The most vulnerable types of animals are the culls and the calves, right? And so again, typically they have a lower fat cover, lower body condition score, immune compromised. Calves are not, they don't have the immunity built up, and cull cows certainly have, they're compromised in many ways, and in the fact that they are actually, their immune system is very low, and even when they get on the truck. So we have, on the calf side of things, you can see that yes, we have more deaths and poor welfare outcomes with calves as well. And we did a separate study on calves and feeders, and in that work, we actually didn't see much difference in, we were trying to look at morbidity and mortality in the feedlot post-transport, and we really didn't see much in that study. So yeah, I think it came out more in our larger survey study that calves and culls were the biggest issue.
Okay. So talking about cull-cow transport, what can be done to improve transport of cull cows at the producer level?
Yeah, so I mean, the biggest thing is to transport that animal before she gets to the point that she just can't manage the transport, right? To send her in good condition, so not at the kind of on the last leg when you want to get rid of her and she's not gonna, you know, you want to make sure she can make the journey. So whatever you send, whatever you put on the truck, whether it's a cull cow, a calf, or whatever, it has to be in adequate condition to meet the journey of that transport under the conditions of that transport.
Okay. So sticking to that kind of thread, is there best management practices for feeding calves or cows before they go on the truck? So does it depend on the time you're going to be transporting them?
Yeah, I know, obviously it's just like anything. The better condition that they go, the better, you know, nutrition, hydration, rest, all of those things. It's kind of the same as humans, right? Like to prepare for any kind of stressful event, you have to be in the condition that you can manage. So typically, what happens when they get off the trailer, mostly with calves, and that's with receiving calves, we know, again, feeding hay, feeding hard protein, making sure they can get to the water quickly and know where the water source is so they can get hydrated, and again, to have lots of bedding so they can lay down and rest appropriately is important.
Okay. So a question here about the 80% bruise after transport. Are you able to know if these were fresh or essentially that they happened during transport, or can you differentiate the ones that happened in transport versus loading?
Yeah, right. So yes, I didn't have much of a chance to describe exactly how we looked at that, but certainly you can tell the difference between a fresh and an older bruise. A fresh bruise will bleed when you pull the hide off, and so those were the bruises that we were looking at. We didn't look at any bruising that, or we didn't count any bruising that didn't have that kind of bleeding when you took the hide off.
Okay. So a question here about the government looking at proposing shorter transport duration for livestock. Does your research agree with shorter transport time?
Say your question again, Stacy.
So the question here was, with the government looking at shortening the amount of time cattle can be transported for, does your research agree with this?
Well, transport up to, as I think in some of my earlier graphs you saw there, so looked like kind of the 24 to 28 hour mark seemed to be kind of the magic number beyond which we seem to have more troubles, right? So, I mean, I think under the new regulations, those animals can go 12 and 36 hours before they need an 8-hour rest, depending on the type of animal they are. So the shorter duration, it really will depend again on the type of animal and the conditions of that transport. So I think we've seen and just some anecdotal evidence that animals even transported short distances can have higher dart cutters. They can suffer more stress just by the fact that loading and unloading can be more stressful than the actual, once they get on the trailer and they kind of settle down and get a chance to relax. We have seen some of that as well in some of our studies. So I think what we really need to do the studies to show that, you know, what is the kind of the best rest period of time, or does it really matter, or is it causing more stress than actually leaving them on the trailer? Something we need to find out.
Okay. So I have a couple of questions coming in here about shipping bred cows to auction with calves that were removed just a couple hours before. And should you be removing those calves sooner, or how soon should you be removing calves from cows?
So I mean, again, the idea is that you don't want cows in heavy lactation going on the trailer, right? And I think the rule under the CFIA, if I'm remembering correctly, is within 12 hours of last milking or last suckling, right? So again, you don't want there's discomfort and pressure built up in the udder from not being milked, and so obviously the sooner you want those cows to be dried off before you send them to the auction.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions on the best what to do, I guess, about cows with Johne's disease? Kind of a specific one.
That I will decline, because I don't. Yeah, that's not my area. Sorry.
For sure. No, that's all right. So I do have a couple more questions coming in here, but I think we have 2 or 3 more, and then we will, if nothing else comes in, we will move on. So if you do have any pressing questions, get them in right away. Has anyone done any research on effects of transport on mature cull bulls, or have you just done research on cattle or cows? Sorry.
Good question. We haven't, and I haven't seen any research on that. It's obviously it's not often, and they don't tend to go long distances, but it doesn't mean that they it seems like we just don't have as much of that information. We had some in our survey, but it was a very low percentage of bulls, actually. Most of what we got was fats and feeders going south into the US, fats mostly.
Okay. Did you consider the economic losses from bruising and other effects?
Did we consider so?
I guess any of the economic analysis from the way I read the question.
Unfortunately, I did not work with an economist on this. It's something that I think we really would be nice to incorporate in all of the studies that we do. We're actually poor in incorporating some of those things, and I think we really need to get better at incorporating those so we can get those numbers back to the producers. So I take that point, and I think that's something that we can improve as a research group for sure.
Okay. Kind of along the lines of a similar question that was asked earlier, but is there a best feeding strategy to prepare animals for transport?
So again, I'm not a nutritionist, but anytime you have animals that are going to be under a lot of stress and can enable to manage that stress better, again, good depends on the type of animal, right? So the fats, we have no problems. They're on a high grain, low forage diet, but we saw the least amount of problems. They're very robust animals, and so feeding I think is not as important as feeding probably for younger or cull animals. So again, good long hay, high protein, kind of before, and more important after transport for recovery.
All right. So the next question here, and actually I will answer this one, Karen, but if you have anything to add, please do. But we have had a couple questions come in about additional resources on this subject. So with this webinar, we will send out a link to watch a recording of this webinar, so you will be able to view it again. As well as in that email, there will be some additional resources, including some infographics that we've made up at BCRC, as well as links to other groups and things that are on our website as well. But do you have anything else to add that's a good resource, Karen?
I think, well, you guys have done some excellent, everything mostly of what we've done has been on the BCRC website with the fact sheets, and there's always links to all of the related research. So other people that have done, and we usually cite those in our papers, our papers are published in journals, but all of that information, really probably the most useful for producers, is on your website.
Right. So just one final question here, Karen. It's kind of a summary type question, actually worked out. But can you tell us what you think in the area of transport? What do you think is the biggest success story, and what is the biggest area for improvement in terms of the beef industry?
So I think the biggest area of that needs improvement is, again, the whole cull-cow transport. I think we do, again, the fats. We're doing, actually, the good news story is we actually have very low death rates of the fat cattle, of the millions of fat cattle that we send south to the US. The bigger issues, of course, are the cull cows, and knowing whether it's cull or not, cows or not, animals that are in poor condition should never go on the trailer. So it's really where we need the biggest kind of push or improvements on to making sure we don't, it's not a negative for the industry, that we don't have a negative image from that. And I think it's really more an education piece. But I think overall, the good news story is I think we're doing a pretty good job, and we just need to tweak some of the areas and at least know where they are. And that's what this research allows us to do, seeing where the holes are, where we're doing well, and where we need to improve. And overall, I would say we're doing pretty good, but the downfall is on the culls.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Karen. So with that, we'll wrap up the question and answer. I do have a couple more things to let you guys know before you log off here really quickly. The first is how to get more information and science-based production advice through both the BCRC and Ag Canada. You can join either of our free email lists. If you have a Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube account, you can connect with either group there as well. And I wanted to remind you about our next webinar, which will be taking place December 11th, and we will be talking about effectively using nasal vaccines. So please join us for that. In the chat window on your control panel, you're going to notice a link to complete our webinar survey. And so I've posted it there twice now. So please do take a couple moments, click on that survey, and do fill that out. It gives us information about what you liked about this webinar, things that, and any suggestions you have for future webinars. So we really take those into consideration when planning our webinars to do things that actually matter to you as producers. As I mentioned, you're going to be receiving an email within the next couple of days with a link to watch this recording, as well as some supplemental information. So keep an eye out for that. And with that, that is all I have. So thank you to everybody at home for joining us tonight. And on behalf of everybody watching, thank you, Karen, for taking the time to share your expertise with us.
Thanks very much, Stacy. Have a good evening, everybody.